Okay, well, let's pick up on some of those themes now and start our journey through Southeast Asia. We're going to start in the South China Sea with the Philippines because that, of course, is really the topic of the day. Almost every single day, and we cover this in minute detail, every confrontation between the Philippines and China Coast Guards gets documented in our daily coverage, in our newsletter. And what's interesting is the intensity of the confrontations and the consistency of them and the frequency are all going up. And so in your recent edition of the ASEAN Walk that came out last week, you talked about the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit that's going to happen this week. And also President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was in Australia, where he spoke to a joint session of the House of Representatives. But what he did there, and I want to play a little bit of sound to get your reaction to some of his comments, is he laid down the fact that he is not going to make any compromises or concessions to China when it comes to the territorial disputes. Let's listen to remarks from President Ferdinand Marcos.
Today, that peace, that stability, and our continued success have come under threat. Once again, we must come together as partners to face the common challenges confronting the region. Not one single country can do this by itself. I shall never tire of repeating the declaration that I made from the first day that I took office. I will not allow any attempt by any foreign power to take even 1 square inch of our sovereign territory. The challenges that we face may be formidable, but equally formidable is our resolve. We will not yield.
So very tough talk coming from the president there. Now, it's interesting the reference to 1 square inch because the Chinese themselves, on many occasions going back at least 10 years, have also said they will not yield 1 inch of territory. So that reference to inch is very important. Now, let me just give you a flavor of what the Chinese rhetoric is. And most of it is in Chinese, but I want to play you a piece of sound from Hu Xinjin. Now, Hu Xinjin, if those of you are not familiar, he is one of the king trolls. I think of him as the Tucker Carlson of China. He is affiliated with the Global Times newspaper, which is the Communist Party's newspaper. It's a tabloid. In many respects, he's a gadfly, and you don't really pay too much attention to him. But in this particular case, the rhetoric that he's conveying is very much in line with the official rhetoric coming out of both the PLA and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I want to give you a sample of some of what the folks in China are also saying about the Philippines.
We advise the Philippines to think clearly. If it continues to escalate provocations, the situation in Renai Reef will escalate significantly, and China will firmly fight to the end. The Philippines will undoubtedly suffer the most. Its dream of overpowering China in the South China Sea is just wishful thinking.
Okay, Prashanth, there we have it. The rhetoric is tough on all sides. The United States has been equally adamant in its support of the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Treaty and saying that at any point, if the Philippines wants to call that in, they can. And during these confrontations, we've had P-8 Poseidon aircraft overhead. We've had the United States Navy observing them. U.S. Coast Guard cutters are in the area as well. This is an incredibly tense situation. The thing that I want to get your take on is that none of the 3 major actors, the U.S., the Chinese, or the Philippines, have put any off-ramps in their rhetoric or their policy, making any kind of concession to de-escalate this situation almost impossible. What do you take away from Marcos's and even Hu's rhetoric about where we are today in this confrontation?
Yeah, I think we're still in a phase right now where it's a bit of a sort of feeling out period where you have President Marcos coming into office. And I don't think, frankly, I was speaking to some Philippine policy officials before he came to power. I don't think anyone was expecting that he would adopt this sort of strident stance towards China and move so close to the United States. But I think that essentially has been what has happened, in part because from Marcos's perspective, that was really the option that he had, given the sort of challenges he was facing from China. And so now that we have the situation, I think you have the Philippines, kind of reinforcing the alliance with the United States, working more with other countries, including Australia, Japan, and others to do more in terms of the balancing part of the situation to increase the Philippines' position against China. And, that doesn't make Beijing too pleased, obviously. But I think at some point, getting back to the point that you mentioned about off ramps, I do think that the Philippines will need to arrive at a point where there can be a reasonable conversation about how to move forward. And the way that looks, it will have to be very tough talks around very specific issues, whether it's fisheries, energy exploration, and so on and so forth. I think the record is not too encouraging given the history of this, which is, China has found it convenient to, as it builds up its capabilities, to kind of dictate those terms. But that will have to be the only course in which these two countries can go on. Because the other component of this, we're talking a lot about foreign policy, but for Marcos and his domestic dynamics, his issues and challenges actually don't relate much to the South China Sea. Much of the Philippine population agrees very much with what Marcos is doing. His concerns are primarily about propping up the Philippine economy and dealing with his family's legacy, which dates back to Ferdinand Marcos and the dictatorship in the Philippines. And he's got midterm elections that are coming up next year as well. So he needs to consolidate his domestic position, and he doesn't need this kind of over his head for his entire single 6-year term. So something has to give, and I think we're still seeing what that's going to look like in the next couple of years. I mean, just going back to ASEAN for 1 second, there's also a parallel track where ASEAN and China have this sort of seemingly never-ending code of conduct on the South China Sea. And I don't think you'll find anyone in sort of ASEAN diplomatic circles who doesn't agree that that is moving slower than they would like. But I think that's also really important to keep there because it reminds all of the Southeast Asian countries that even though there are 4 claimants in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, all of the Southeast Asian countries will be affected if there's a major conflict in the South China Sea, because that's where a significant amount of the world's trade essentially passes through. There are treaty alliance commitments, as you pointed out there earlier. So that is an important track that goes on, but the ASEAN-China Code of Conduct is not going to solve the situation between China and the Philippines. That's definitely going to be something that they need to work out for themselves. The role that the United States and other countries can play is to make sure there's a favorable balance of power so that these countries are able to resolve their disputes with China, and that this is done so in a peaceful way and in a lawful way. And I think that's really the dynamic that hopefully will prevail in the coming year.
Okay, let's pick up on that part of the conversation. I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago that said, what happens to the Philippines if Trump wins? Okay? Mm-hmm. So here we have a situation where Donald Trump has already expressed that Taiwan is not going to be a key priority for him in his next administration. He had an interview with Maria Bartiromo on Fox News. She asked him about this. He was very clear that in his worldview, Taiwan is not a top priority. For him, making a deal with China is going to be his top priority, as he's said over and over again. And this is one of the things about Trump, is that there's no subtlety or mystery to what his positions are. He wants a trade deal. He wants a deal, right? And he is willing to put the chips on the table to get the big deal with the Chinese. Already he's said that he can end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, I think it was, if he just brings everybody together. But he's made it clear that he supports some of the conservatives in the Congress who don't support funding the war in Ukraine. That got me wondering, would the United States go to war with the largest navy in the world, starting effectively what is a world war, over some rocks in the South China Sea? And there is a debate in Washington that's going on right now about the merits of the mutual defense treaties, that should it be about an invasion of the Philippine homeland that the United States would come to defend, or is it at any territory within the exclusive economic zone, which is in the South China Sea as well? And I'm not entirely convinced that there's a lot of domestic political support to go to war with China over some rocks in the South China Sea, the Scarborough Shoal. And so there is a strain of thought within the Chinese body politic that says, let's just wait to see if Trump wins. Because if Trump wins, the dynamic changes in their view. Because they've seen that what's happened with Ukraine, they've seen that Trump has been averse to these kinds of conflicts. I'm curious, you're in Washington, you talk with official Washington. Do you think there is an appetite to confront the Chinese in a Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of 2 pieces to that. One is, it's very hard, as you said, to predict what Donald Trump would do in situation A or situation B. I think The one thing we can say is that under the Trump administration, what we did see with respect to the Philippines was there was a perception in the Philippines. And when you go to the Philippines, you still hear this from some people in policy circles that under the Obama administration, particularly with respect to Scarborough Shoal, when the United States tried to broker an arrangement between China and the Philippines, and essentially the Chinese reneged on that, and the Philippines essentially lost Scarborough Shoal. A view of some people in the Philippines was that, that was a moment of betrayal, really, for the US Philippine alliance. And it already showed that the United States would be unwilling to sort of commit when it came to the South China Sea. But fast forward a few years later, and you had Donald Trump come into office and take a very, very tough stance against China. And part of that was under the Trump administration, actually, was where you first started to see more clarity, relatively speaking, about the Mutual Defense Treaty, what would happen in the South China Sea. And that's carried on in the Biden administration as well. Now, would that necessarily sustain itself if Trump came back to office after an election? It's hard to say, but I think that Trump's line on Russia versus China and the kind of views you have in the Republican Party on Russia and China are quite different because the China threat is seen as more of a challenge, relatively speaking, than the Russia challenge or the Russia threat. There's more unity around that. But whether that translates into the South China Sea more specifically, that remains to be seen because, there's much more talk even now in Washington on Taiwan than there is on the South China Sea. In fact, the Philippine ambassador to the United States, I think, just said something to the effect about a few days ago that in spite of the fact that we're talking a lot about Taiwan, we need to be talking more about the South China Sea, an eventual scenario. Frankly, I do think that it's very difficult for me to see if there's an overt sort of Chinese confrontation against the Philippines, a US president not doing anything if it was so clear that China was infringing on Philippine rights, given how big the asymmetry is and how big the situation is with respect to the sort of China conversation in Washington. But of course, if there's shades of gray, if there are questions around who did what and what ship ran into which one, there could be some uncertainty around that. But I think even under a Trump administration or a second Biden administration, we will see U.S. policy on the South China Sea, at least when it comes to the U.S.-Philippine alliance, be quite constant. There'll be some change, but mostly continuity. Now, the bigger question, though, is the Philippines and domestic politics, because you had, a few years ago, you just had Rodrigo Duterte, who was trying to end parts of the US-Philippine alliance and was actually setting aside this international ruling that the Philippines won. So I think we also need to keep in mind, and in my last trip to the Philippines, I heard this from, a lot of the Philippine sources that I trust a lot. Even as you see Marcos and the current Philippine government take a very tough line on China, there is no guarantee that, every 6 years the Philippines, changes its position and has a very different leader. So that's the other piece of the equation that I think we have a lot less certainty on. And we're going to have midterm elections in the Philippines next year. Marcos's domestic political position, as I said, pretty strong on these security issues, foreign policy issues. Still remains to be seen, though, on some of these more kind of family legacy issues, economics, and so on and so forth.
And it's good that you brought up Duterte because this is also one of the domestic political issues that Marcos is facing is that there's real challenges from the Duterte factions pressuring him not only on China, but on crime and any number of issues. And so the Duterte faction is something interesting to watch. Before we move on to other countries, because I do want to get some other takes of yours from the different parts of the region here, what's your forecast for the rest of the year in terms of how you think things are going to play out between China, Philippines, and the U.S. in the South China Sea? What do you see happening?
I think there is a good chance that things may get worse before they get better. I think we're at a place right now where the Philippines last year was still trying to get some of its alignments and kind of networking in order, sort of working through the starting of joint patrols with the United States and Australia, still talk of some sort of access agreement with Japan. But these things are going to happen in 2024, and they're going to happen much more frequently. And I don't see China sort of easing its pressure in the South China Sea at all. So, I think there's a big chance that some sort of mini crisis could happen. And that's very worrying because you've got a mixture of dynamics. Like I said, you've got the US election here, which is going to happen later this year. You've got the Philippines preparing for a midterm election as well. And you've got, other countries in the Indo-Pacific as well. I mean, Australia is going to be having an election within the next year or so, right? So these dynamics are very troubling because they affect foreign policy, but they also affect domestic dynamics there as well.